Little Nightmares. I remember seeing this game when it made the rounds when it was first coming out. This horror platformer that had an art style very similar to clay stop motion animation, it felt like a natural fit. So while I didn't play the game when it first came out, I think I just had other stuff going on at the time, it was on my list of games to play at some point. Little Nightmares was developed by Tarsier Studios, a Swedish studio that worked on the Little Big Planet series and Tearaway Folder. But Little Nightmares would be the game that really put them on the map. The team wanted to make a game that used their previous platforming knowledge, but also incorporate horror. So the idea was to make a small character that you controlled who didn't have combat abilities and had to hide as much as possible. Not a stealth game because they felt that empowered the player too much. They felt it was more accurate to call it a hide-and-seek game. They also wanted the game to have a dollhouse viewpoint to embrace the sense of scale and be able to frame scenes in the way they wanted while the player was still in control. The game's original working title was Hunger, but it was changed to Little Nightmares so the team could portray more types of horror. Also, when people googled Hunger Game, they would get the Hunger Games series instead, making it a lot harder to search for. And a sequel was announced at Gamescom 2019 and later released on October 30th, 2020. So initially I was just gonna review Little Nightmares 1 and its DLC and then just call it there. But then I started to think, did I really want to wait a year to review Little Nightmares 2? And the two games are so similar, so you know what? Screw it. We're looking at it all today. Little Nightmares 1, the DLC for the first game, and Little Nightmares 2. Though I purchased the first game while it was on sale for the sake of a review on Steam, and then a week later Bandi Namco gave it away for free. And then a little while after recording the second game, they released a patch adding in 4K and ray tracing and all of that stuff. Why does my timing suck when it comes to stuff like this? But just as a heads up, the games are on all major systems right now, but for the first game, I highly recommend you stay away from the Switch version. The game has a 1.5-minute load after every death, and considering these are games with a lot of trial and error in them, that is a game killer right there. Though I hear the Switch did get a decent port of 2, just not on the same graphical power as the other systems, so you should be fine there. Anyway, let's dive into this Little Nightmare. Okay, so Little Nightmares is one of those put it together yourself kind of narratives. There isn't a single spoken line of dialogue, so you have to go off of context clues to try and figure it out for yourself. Now, I won't get too much into theory discussion here, but the basic gist of the first game is you play as this little girl named Six, and in the DLC, the runaway kid, as they try to escape this place called the Maw. This floating sub at sea where everyone on board is a grotesque being that are trying to consume any meat they see. Even if it includes small children. Yeah, that's how far they've gone. Needless to say, these kids are trying to escape and survive by any means necessary. In 2, we take control of this kid named Mono, as he ventures into the Pale City, a place where people have been hypnotized by these TVs and become shells of their former selves. But that's all I can really get into without spoiling stuff, as it really shows you various events, and you kinda have to draw your own conclusions based on those. And usually, that can be a hard sell for me, because sometimes that can come off as being too vague for its own good. But for the most part, I think Little Nightmares manages to walk that line to where it's easy to understand, but it leaves a lot of room for theory discussion and the like, and carrying a lot of the work is the presentation. Little Nightmares as a series I was always interested in purely from its art design. Looking at the game, I was given massive Coraline vibes, as the characters had a very clay stop motion appearance to them, yet radiated this uncanny valley aesthetic that really helps tap into the best aspects of those material that were aimed at kids, but weren't afraid to give them nightmare fuel. In the first game, everything just looks gross and disgusting, while super stylized, really selling the atmosphere. The patrons alone, god, they tell you everything you need to know about how the Maw works. And the chefs, one of my favorite monster designs in the whole game. Their faces just have a very uneasy feeling to them, but even more so when you realize that's a mask they're wearing. So then what the hell does their actual face look like? Why would they be wearing that? It's those questions that really nail the atmosphere and the context storytelling that the game is going for. It also helps that Six's design is great. The raincoat makes her pop out in the world almost as if she doesn't belong here, which once again adds to the storytelling, but also means you can tell where she is at all times. And even if the game can be a little dark, you do always have this lighter to help guide your way. Which, on a side note, I really want to mention, how does she manage to flick this thing right every time? Have you ever tried one of these things? It's not easy to do that consistently. Though in the first game, I do think it can be a little too dark for its own good at times. Even with the game's brightness on max, I had a hard time navigating some areas, and it was kind of more apparent in the DLC, where the runaway kid doesn't stick out as much, and it feels like the game's either too bright or too dark on the same setting. That's not the case in the sequel though. I only had to adjust the lighting slightly, but the big thing helping here is that there is much better lighting. They use a lot more backlight to fill in scenes, and I feel the mood of each area is captured even better. Which is even more impressive considering that the main character here is completely brown, ditching the solution that they had in the original, which I think is both a testament to how much better the lighting got here and how good Mono's design is. I really love the coat, and he has such a strong silhouette that makes it easy to tell where he is at all times. And while you can change out the paper bag for a bunch of different hats, honestly, I think the bag is what kind of makes the whole design work. It's strangely comforting, but also a mystery, like he's hiding something from both others and the player. I also love how small they make the player feel. You can really feel how your size is not compatible with anything in the world, and makes it all the more daunting. I think it's played up a little bit more in the first game, but it is there in the sequel as well. Carrying a lot of the weight of the presentation is the sound design, and while the music is good, there's a lot of ambient noise kind of music, but when a song pops out and played in a memorable location, it makes its presence known. I love 6's theme, and especially Prison Toys in the original. In 2's soundtrack, I love Togetherness, and the main theme does a great job representing the mood of the game. But when I'm talking about the sound design, I'm more talking about the sound effects. Like in the first game, I love the stealth sections because you have this heartbeat anytime you go near a boss, and it gets faster and faster as they're closing in on you, with a loud shriek if you're caught. It does a great job in building the tension, and I can't really show this part off in the footage, but the controller also vibrates in correspondence with the heartbeat. It's super cool. It gets even better in the sequel as all the sound effects become much more human and creepy. The mannequin rattling, the heavy breathing, but also for empowering sound effects. Like I love when you're dragging the hammer and you can just hear it rattle across the floor. Even more so when you're running and the sound really just sells how heavy the object is. Or slamming the hammer down onto one of these movie cans feels really good. So yeah, the Little Nightmares series is fantastic when it comes to its presentation, and one of the best selling points about both games. But how about their gameplay? So the gameplay of Little Nightmares is fairly simple. You go through a series of escape rooms as you try to figure out a solution to the room and move on to the next one. You can jump, climb, maybe use an object to throw depending on the situation. That's about it. The rest of your kit is reliant on what's in the room, like finding areas to hide where you can crouch and slide underneath obstacles, grabbing a key for a locked door, or using a loud sound to distract a monster in another room. But keep in mind, these guys are super sensitive to any kind of sound, so if you knock something over, sprint on the floors, that will alert them to your presence, and you'll have to make a run for it. And in Little Nightmares, there's no health. You die in one hit per se, but checkpoints are aplenty and you have infinite lives, so you just need to power through a solution. In the sequel, combat is a bigger focus as you can pick up objects and swing them at enemies, though your swings are very heavy, so missing one will most likely result in death. You also have more interactables, such as the flashlight that you can use to stun enemies, or a remote control that you can use to manipulate people. You also have your companion 6, who can lift you up to reach platforms, grab you, and pull you up from a ledge, and most importantly, hold hands. It's very cute. And honestly, that's about it for the gameplay. Again, it's really simple, but how does Little Nightmares benefit from this simplicity? So the good in Little Nightmares. One thing I'm very appreciative of is that Little Nightmares never really relies on jump scares. There are for sure things that will spook you and there are sharp loud sounds, but the scares never come off as cheap or hollow. All of its horrors come from the environment, monsters, and the story being the driving force, which for me is how I prefer it. And it's the type of horror that will make me think about it long after I finish the game, trying to piece together what happened in this world and how certain things got to that point. It gives you just enough to nibble on, but never tells you outright. Though the game also knows how to ramp up the horror through a sense of escalation and dread. The first game has a good example of this, where Six starts to get more hungry, and you know, at the beginning she eats a bread that's given to her and the like, and why she doesn't grab anything from the kitchen to eat is beyond me. Seriously, Six, you had your chance. But later in the game, she gets more desperate, putting it lightly, and these are easily some of the most memorable parts of the game. All I'll say on that one, you know the one. Girl, that was just unnecessary. You had an easy way out. Which, if you want to talk about those fears, the monster designs are aces. In the first game, I've already mentioned the chefs and the patrons for their grotesque appearances that make you feel all kind of uneasiness. But the janitor with his sound design where it sounds like his bones are constantly popping and cracking, ugh. And his long arms make it so you feel like you can get caught by him at any second. They brought this guy back for the DLC because they knew how good he was in the main game. And while the lady, the big bad herself, is neat, she is kind of underused. So the best monster in the first game for me goes to the DLC's Granny, who you don't really get a good look at, but she hunts you down while you platform over the water, and she's fast and unrelenting, easily the most stressful part of the game. But the sequel, I think, ramps it up with the monster game even more. You got the big bad of the game, the Thin Man, who really reeks of these Slender Man vibes, and can slow the environment down when you're by him, making for close calls. Not to mention the warped citizens of the Pale City, who don't even have recognizable faces anymore. The doctor who can crawl around like Spider-Man, and the mannequins who will hunt you down relentlessly until you flash your light on them. The hunter who has godlike aim when he's shooting for you, and has a thing for taxidermy, including this whole family at his dinner table. Yikes. But hands down, the winner of the entire series for me, the teacher. She's already unnerving enough with her face and presence, and then she does this. Nope. This neck thing honestly just creeps me out. She can chase you down from anywhere, and as long as you're in a room with her, you are not safe, believe me. And I don't want to show it because I don't want to spoil the surprise, but the final chase with her might be my favorite moment in the entire series. It was easily the most panicked I got in any of the playthroughs. And the best way to get past these guys is to stay out of sight. You never really have the power to take them out, so you need to make sure you don't alert them. Though in the first game, you can kinda get away with juking them around the corner and the like, but in the second game, your options to hide are much more limited. You have to get close to them and put yourself in the open, which makes for more tension and risk. But with these encounters, I like that there are multiple ways you can finish them. Like in this one, what you're supposed to do is hide behind this bookcase while the teacher gets dangerously close to you and backs away. Or you can do what I did the first time and hide in this box if you're fast enough and get through the encounter that way. I do also enjoy the game's puzzles. They change a lot depending on the area you're in, but they don't end up feeling dull and keep me engaged throughout. The final area of the DLC really highlights the puzzle nature of the game. I honestly got a lot of Resident Evil vibes from this place, which may have been intentional. The final area of the second game has a really fun puzzle with its final boss, but I obviously can't show you that. And surprisingly, one of the best things about the sequel for me is the bond that ends up forming between Six and Mono. Six is a computer-controlled ally throughout the entire game. You never play as her in 2. But she never gets in the way of what you're doing. I feel like she can only really help. And I think the connection we as the players have, seeing her struggle in the first game, helps, but even having the two traveling, there's a lot of little moments with the two that help making a believable friendship between them. And that bond gets tested quite a bit throughout the game, especially near the end, oh boy. Also, you can hold hands. It's a very important gameplay feature. And the games feel very replayable. They are very short campaigns. The first game, I think it's about 2.5 hours for each one, while the sequel took me about 4.5. And while there is collectibles to go back for, I think the games are short enough to where they are good one-night finisher sort of deals. Like, I could see myself going back to these when the Halloween season arrives. But there will be a few things I'm not looking forward to revisiting these little adventures. Okay, so for my complaints, most of them come from the first game and were fixed in the sequel, but there are some that apply to both. In the original game, you really want to watch your footing when you're on narrow pathways, because on stuff like pipes or beams, you're still moving in 3D at this point, even if the camera makes you think otherwise, so you can just slide right off if you're not careful. Thankfully, the sequel makes it so you're locked onto a 2D plane in these sequences. But in both games, more so the first, there are times where depth perception will work against you, where you think you're going to make a jump just fine, only to be nowhere close to where you were actually trying to platform. While on that note, there definitely were times where it got confusing to tell what was an interactable and what was just scenery, especially when climbing, because they have very specific ways they want you to go through the level, and you can climb on certain bookcases, other ones you can't, and stuff like the visual language isn't exactly clear on that. I can think of 2 specific instances in the first game. In the final parts with the janitor, you need to remove these metal bars from a cage to make a wall go down. But the game doesn't really direct your attention to them, so I thought you just had to avoid him until they gave way, but no. And in the DLC, this room. Okay, what do you think the solution is for this room? Did your attention go to this light that you can pull down? It didn't for me either, because nothing in the game directs your attention to it at all. The second game is much better about that, usually pulling the lighting to a solution, so that they don't feel as facepalm inducing. But even then, I still had some weird hitbox issues happen in the sequel, where on the first run of a section like this with the hands, I got through just fine, but after that, sometimes it would go through, sometimes not. It didn't feel very consistent. Another thing would be in the first game, you actually need to hold onto a key to unlock the door. In 2, they make it so Mono just puts it in his pocket, so his movement doesn't become limited. While on the second game, there are combat sections, and I like how they don't make you feel too overpowered since you really have to commit to the swing, but this is where that depth perception I was talking about comes back into play. I always tried to get enemies into a side view to try and get a better shot, because the depth perception would always cause me to miss. The timing was never the issue, it was purely being off by just enough for it to miss. Having a horizontal swing I feel like would alleviate this issue. Now being fair, the game is very kind with checkpoints, so you never have to redo too much, though sometimes, if I'm honest, it's a little too forgiving with them. There were a few times where I clearly did a puzzle wrong, died, but the game only checks if you made it to that room, so as long as your dead corpse made it there, it acts like you cleared the puzzle. I feel like I cheated out certain rooms that way when I didn't mean to. There were also some times where I accidentally broke rooms in a soft lock kind of way. So in the DLC, there's a point where you need to work with these gnomes in order to pull down a lever, and then move on to this box. Well, one kept getting in the way all the time, so as a joke, I threw him in the toilet like the little shit he was. The problem? He didn't come out of there and I couldn't climb up. So I essentially soft-locked the game and had to restart the entire room again. And I know that one might be more of a me problem since I wasn't doing something the game wanted me to do. But that room did take about 5 to 10 minutes to clear out, so it was long enough that it got annoying. I guess while talking about the AI, while I didn't have much of an issue with it in 2, in the DLC's second chapter, it relies a lot on the AI, and it's kind of shoddy. Sometimes they worked fine, sometimes they didn't. To be fair, it's never in a you'll die sort of situation, but it happened enough to honestly make it my least favorite part of the campaign. In general, the DLC out of the 3 campaigns was probably my least favorite. It felt like many of the ideas burned out too quickly. But the main campaign for one still also has its issues, like the last 2 chapters. Chapter 4 almost has no puzzle solving in it and is purely chases. It works enough, but it makes the chapter go by a little fast and kind of tiring at the same time. And the final chapter is done in like 10 minutes, it's almost just a boss fight. I had the feeling that this was going to have more but was cut for time. What's also weird in 1 is how the lighter doesn't actually come into play for any point of the adventure. Like, it's never the solution to a puzzle at any point, which is kind of weird, not gonna lie. Which is probably why it was turned into a flashlight for the DLC, and in 2 you only had it for 1 chapter, but it makes it the main gameplay mechanic for said chapter. Which also kinda leads into collectibles. You can light these lanterns and hug the gnomes in the first game, but all they do is unlock concept art and slightly change the ending, that's about it. Not much of a reason to go for them. 2 has the benefit of making them collectible hats that you can swap out at any time, and getting glitchy remains, which give you the secret ending, so they're a bit more worthwhile there. And for some people, the adventure might be too short and doesn't have enough to do outside of the main quest. And you know, some people might take issue with that, that's not very long, but I feel like I got just enough of an adventure where it wasn't too short that I was wondering where the rest of it was, but it wasn't too long that it felt like it outstayed its welcome. And yeah, I think Little Nightmares 1 and 2 do a good job in what they set out to do. The Little Nightmares series, while small in scope and size, is a great time with its unique settings and aesthetics, fun gameplay, and fantastic presentation. While they do have some issues, I think the majority of which were fixed in the sequel, they weren't enough to deter me from coming back to the games a lot more than I thought I would be playing them for the sake of the video. I would say 2 is overall my favorite one. It's the most fleshed out, the improved presentation, and easily gave me the most horror-filled experience, but I think 1 is worth it as well. If you buy the first game, the DLC, and 2 and play them all back to back, I would say you got yourself a pretty good time. Well, okay, there are some extra comics that you can read and stuff like that, and you know what? Let's spend a little bit of time talking about this. Very Little Nightmares for mobile devices. So Very Little Nightmares was a mobile game released in May of 2019 that's a prequel to the entire series, where you need to guide a good old yellow rain-coated child out of the way of monsters and the like. It's got a totally different art style, which I'm on and off about. It's not a bad one, but I don't think it really matches the other 2 games, and it doesn't exactly creep me out or unnerve me, but the sound design is on point. The game is also now from a bird's eye point of view instead of a dollhouse setup from the original series, which leads into my biggest issue with the game, the control. See, you need to keep tapping the screen over and over to move, and it gets tiring in no time to do so. And you can't flip the phone into a horizontal view, only vertical, which makes it so you can't see much in front of you, which means a lot more tapping. And you're pretty slow, even with a dash. That really killed my enjoyment for this one, and I only got in about 35 minutes before calling it. Plus, it's $8, and you can get the first game on sale for about the same price, so I recommend just getting that instead unless you're really curious about this one. Now, as for where the series will go from here, well, that's kind of up in the air right now, as the Ambassador Group AB acquired Tarsier, and since the copyright belongs to Namco, they won't be working on the series anymore. But Namco has showed interest in continuing the series, so we'll see whatever comes out from that. And I hope you have a very happy Halloween.